Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. Enter into conflict with people from his superiors. The man lowers his head and frowns. He points out that young individuals like them especially shouldn't do this, and then mutters something about him being an idiot. A man with a beard of dark hair turns to his new acquaintances. He wants to sincerely advise these guys. Calvin is no longer faced by members of the chairman's special forces. He's cursing in shock at the moment. A man with a beard turns his head towards the inside of the car and is surprised to find two of his new acquaintances there. Waylon asks her middle-aged father if he is going to do anything now or not. Calvin is quite nervous. He wonders when they managed to end up in this place and how this could be possible. The man opens his eyes wide as he looks ahead. He remembers that Mr. Liu is a time trader. The middle-aged father opens his mouth. He tilts his head and looks down with interest. The man says that the ecology professor from their club said that their boss could extend his son's time, and then asks if this is true. A man with disheveled black hair leans forward and opens his mouth. He demands that Calvin stop talking for the moment, and then warns that if they are not wanted here, they will leave, but the man will pay for their first-class plane ticket back. Waylon looks forward seriously and smiles slyly. He claims that they came here to discuss some plan, but they have very little time. The man with a beard of dark hair is silent. The car is still in the parking lot. The fighters warn their boss client that he will soon receive a fake email and will need to use it to direct the spotter to the wrong target. The wheel of some car. New acquaintances of the middle-aged father explain that at this time they are pretending to be bodyguards who were hired to accompany their interlocutor's son. The man is quite nervous. He asks the fighters if everything will really be that simple. The guy with the scar on his cheek smiles. Calvin states that although their opponents do not have superpowers, they have spent a lot of resources training their people. Waylon frowns and tilts her head down. He says that it is for this reason that it is necessary to strictly adhere to this plan, because otherwise it could end quite sadly for their rivals. A corridor in some hospital. Calvin walks in a certain direction when all the paramedics look closely at him. The man is quite scared. In it, someone addresses him by name. A guy with short cocoa-colored hair closes his eyes and smiles. He says that it seemed to him that Calvin was leaving for his work. A man with a beard stands opposite a guy in a green uniform and makes a vague gesture with his hand. He claims to have received an email from a friend who claims that there is a doctor in a German clinic who knows how to cure his son. The medical worker frowns and looks ahead suspiciously. The father of the neighboring years smiles happily and nods his head. He assures that he is going to pick up Smith at the same moment and cordially says goodbye to the nurse. Calvin hurries further down the corridor. The health worker becomes more gloomy and gloomy. He puts his hand up to his face and does certain things. A guy with short cocoa-colored hair is looking in the other direction. He asks his boss if he heard this conversation and what they should do next. The guy looks away and becomes more gloomy. He asks his boss if he should take tougher measures. Someone is standing in an unknown space. He says that the time has come to break the limits of what is permitted. The unknown man smiles insidiously. He mutters something about a country called Germany. A man with blonde curls looks forward madly. He claims that this boy does not matter to them since they only need to keep Calvin under their control. The blonde man looks out the large window. He claims that for him the trick that his employee is about to pull off is quite interesting. Two people who serve in a special detachment are standing in a hospital room. Smith asks if the place he will be arriving in is actually Germany. The boy sits on the bed and points his finger at the guys in strange uniforms next to him. He asks questions about whether he will go alone and whether this is true. Calvin smiles good-naturedly and closes his eyes. He gently addresses his child and explains that in this place he can be cured and they cannot lose such an opportunity. Smith looks at his father with interest. The man claims that these strange people will protect him along the way. The boy is laughing quietly at the moment. The patient folds his arms across his chest and looks at his father. The boy claims that all people know that airplanes are considered one of the safest modes of transport. Calvin mutters something unintelligible. A man with a beard looks ahead in surprise. Waylon and his colleague and middle-aged father stand around Smith's bed. The cocoa-haired health worker smiles good-naturedly. He notifies Mr. Calvin that the company has checked the mail and he can safely send his son for treatment to this country. A man with a beard of dark hair becomes more gloomy. He claims this is wonderful news. The guy opens his eyes and mouth wide. He looks at Waylon and his colleague with suspicion. The nurse asks who these two people are. Calvin looks forward resolutely. He explains that these men are bodyguards for his son, and then asks if he really has the right to hire workers to protect his son. The guy with short hair nods his head and makes vague gestures with his hands. He claims that the man with the beard misunderstood him and these actions are permitted. The paramedic is smiling wickedly now. He tilts his head and looks forward menacingly. He claims that he will have to report this incident to his boss. The middle-aged father is scared. Waylon addresses the hospital worker. He asks if he can tell the man in the green uniform something. Soldiers from a special squad surrounded a man with a beard who was very worried. Waylon claims that this gentleman has already paid a huge price for their work. Calvin quickly agrees and adds that he can no longer cancel this order. The guy with a scar on his face looks seriously at his interlocutor. He says that the company they work for values utwo 100B such a skill is punctuality. Waylon calmly raises her head. He claims that if they are late, their boss will be quite unhappy. The nurse opens his eyes wide in surprise. The pretend bodyguard explains that their master simply values time. A man with a beard of dark hair is in a state of horror. He thinks that the fighters said all this in vain, since people from this company do not respond to threats. A guy with short cocoa-colored hair spreads his arms and smiles. He claims that he was simply misunderstood and reminds that they are in a free country where no one can restrict human freedom. The nurse frowns and smiles insidiously. He says that he only wanted to warn them that the company would provide them with a special bus to the airport. Waylon and his colleague are calm at the moment. Calvin is quite scared. He looks in horror at a man with disheveled black hair who behaves completely normally. He claims that this development of events will be very good, due to the fact that he is not quite used to transport in this country. The medical worker closes his eyes. He assures that in this case the EU needs to fill out some important documents. Smith, Calvin and their false bodyguards watch as the hospital assistant leaves. He closes the door to the room from the outside. The guy becomes more gloomy. An unknown person is in an unknown space. The health worker asks him what they should do in this situation. This individual claims that the sick child is the only way they can keep Calvin at bay. He's smiling wickedly at the moment. The person says that this patient should be under their control. The man with blue eyes frowns. He's smiling widely now. The boss claims that if anyone tries to take this boy away from them, they will make him die. The hospital worker tilts his head down and sighs heavily. He becomes more sinister. The paramedic and Calvin watch as the child is loaded into the car. He asks his middle-aged father if he feels better. A guy with short curls folds his arms across his chest and looks at a tired man with a beard. He says that they will not see each other soon. The health worker turns his head and looks forward with excitement. He asks the patient's father if he is sure that the child will be taken better care of in that place than in their hospital. Calvin is quite scared. The guy in the green suit pats the man on the shoulder and laughs. He insists that it was just a joke. A health worker from the bus calls him in. He claims that they can drive towards the airport. The middle-aged father turns around. He says that it's time for him to leave since he still has things to do that he hasn't finished. The nurse watches the client's father leave. He loudly agrees with him. The guy with short cocoa-colored hair frowns. An ambulance is driving along the road. A man with disheveled black hair sits next to the driver. The car drives past various fields. The special squad officer looks at his neighbor. He claims that he doesn't remember them visiting this place when driving from the airport, and it looks pretty abandoned. The driver frowns at him. The hospital worker becomes more threatening. Waylon moves her eyebrows towards the bridge of her nose. The car slides along the road. There was a large stain of red liquid left on the glass. There is a bloody pistol on the floor. Smith sleeps peacefully on his couch. The men from the special squad claim that the child is safe and they need to move on. The man's dead body hit the ground with a thud. Boka Wang was closing the back door of ambulance number 2 with his hands on his hips, looking at the corpses lying around. He said that one should always remember not to waste a weapon and a jacket. He thought for a moment when his partner turned to him and asked, a little puzzled, where to hide him in this case. The two boys looked at each other with malicious grins. As they headed towards the entrance of the car, Wang told his comrade to send a message to that bald man, Calvin. Number 2 asked if he was really ready to do this, and then added that he thought it would be very difficult for him. The partner indignantly replied that he didn't care about this at all, and they should stick to the plan. The bright light of the full moon enveloped a huge multi-story building. At this time, Calvin was walking along the corridor, and upon hearing the sound of an incoming notification, he stopped and then looked into the gadget with a dumbfounded face. A message on his phone said his son was safe and they were preparing to fly out. After reading this information, the man smiled joyfully and a sparkle appeared in his eyes. His mood quickly changed to serious as he furrowed his brows and thought that it was his turn now. He walked up to the huge metal door and put his hand on the scanner. A robotic voice announced that his identity had been verified and then greeted Professor Calvin. For a few moments, the man froze, pressing his lips into a thin stripe. He thought that this was all nonsense, and he just needed to get into the server room of the institute. He encouraged himself, mentally saying that nothing special was required for this and he would succeed. When the man opened the door, rays of light began to leak into the cramped room. He walked around several rows of server equipment and peered out from behind one of them. Calvin looked at the small silver flash drive in his hand, thinking that all he had to do was insert it. Approaching one of the many server equipment, he inserted the flash drive into the slot with a soft click. Looking at her with frightened eyes, while sweat ran down his forehead, he wondered if he had done everything right. The man jerked sharply and turned around with a puzzled face when he heard the door to the room open again, and then saw the echo of a medical uniform. Armed men with pistols quickly ran into the server room, and behind them stood a nurse who had previously been assigned to Smith. They shouted loud curses and said that Calvin should put his hands up. A young man in a medical uniform squinted his eyes, showing his predatory grin. He noted in a low voice that he did not expect to meet Mr. Calvin so soon. The professor froze, looking at him with a discouraged look. The nurse smiled contentedly as the armed men pinned the man to the floor, pointing a gun at his head. He asked him if he really believed that his old friend would help him get out of here. He added that they actually have eyes and ears everywhere. The young man in medical uniform straightened his back, looking down at the professor with a contemptuous gaze. He said that from now on they have irrefutable evidence and they will keep him in custody for 24 hours. He added that this is the highest level of supervision. One of the men with the gun turned to the young man and, calling him boss, threw a silver flash drive in his direction. Stretching out his hand, the nurse caught it with a quiet clap, saying that if you still want to hide something, then next time you need to hire a team of professionals. Holding the flash drive between his fingers and lifting it, he smiled arrogantly, adding that you also need to have professional equipment with you. His eyes widened when several lights in the server room went out. Everyone in the room began to spin around when they heard a loud unknown voice. He asked if they really thought that you could just get rid of this thing if you pulled it out. He added a little indignantly that he wrote the program the whole night, so you shouldn't underestimate people. Mimicking the boss nurse, the voice said that if they really want to improve their protection against thieves, then they need to hire a team of professionals and purchase professional equipment. A young man in a medical uniform loudly asked in bewilderment who was saying this, noting that it was impossible to get into the radio room. Bulging his frightened eyes, he pursed his lips into a thin stripe and swallowed when Robert, sitting at that moment in his office in front of the monitors, crossed his legs and said that he now had all the information about them. He noted that now they seemed naked in front of him, so there was nothing to be ashamed of. Turning to his armed subordinates, the boss shouted loudly that this man needed to be arrested urgently. With a grin on his face, Robert replied that it was too late. At this moment, the trio of bandits suddenly froze as they were attacked simultaneously. Calvin watched with shocked eyes as the two armed men, as well as their boss, began to fall dead, blood pouring out of their mouths. The professor froze with a frightened face as two soldiers from the squad with silver masks on their faces stood behind him. Robert noted that the task was completed and then said that their people were now in an unusual state and they were sleepy to get the man out of the hospital safe and sound. Looking through the CCTV cameras at the corridors littered with corpses, the programmer asked Calvin not to worry since all the obstacles were in the institute. Switching to the image from another camera, he saw exactly the same picture and noted that all the obstacles had already been destroyed. Robert, with a satisfied grin on his face, folded his fingers into an inverted V, and the professor, who had not yet recovered from the shock, pursed his lips into a thin stripe, listened to his words at his current task. With his hands folded behind his head, the hacker leaned back on his computer chair and said that the man should come to them. Tears began to well up in Calvin's shocked eyes when the programmer, flashing his glasses, smiled and said that this was necessary for a reunion with his son. In the open air in the backyard there were various green plants, and inside the adjacent room there was a board with black and white counters on a table. A male voice noted that this month had passed too unnoticed for him. Seated on opposite sides of the table in large wicker chairs were Waiwen and Lu Lai. The guy became thoughtful when the girl said that time is a thing that is very easily wasted. Mr. Liu raised his hand, holding a white chip between his fingers, and inquired about the adaptation of father and son to this estate. Lowering her eyes, the girl smiled softly and said that everything seemed to be going well for those who had forgotten what a normal life was. She added that in the end, they saved them. The young man touched his chin with his fingers and grinned, turning up the corner of his lips. Still smiling, Waiwen closed her eyes and began to tell her that in Country X, work had been completed on the main laboratory, the Flora and Fauna Ecology laboratories, and the Genetics and Cytology laboratories. Looking up at her boss, she began to tell her that the world historian Walter Urey suddenly disappeared missing due to mysterious circumstances. The famous mathematician Callie from Country G also disappeared. She said that the best cell biologist of the country Y. Heyman and the famous engineer of the country M. Bernard were missing. Lu Lai leaned back in his chair and smiled broadly, noting that they were in good spirits all around. Waiwen narrowed her eyes when the boss said that he had one more question. The guy and the girl gave each other sly smiles. Mr. Liu asked how many organizations are interested in them around the world. The girl replied that it was a lot. Looking at the young man with a satisfied face, she added that especially since they started inviting many specialists, and even organizations of your rank decided to play with fire. She also noted that they were, of course, excited. A dark image of several fighters in dark cloaks standing on the roof of one of the tall buildings appeared in her head. She said that in order to maintain their worldwide status, the secret squad makes every second count. Waiwan said that she should point out that the boss's secret squad is very effective and capable of keeping people at bay. Lu Lai closed his eyes and smiled contentedly when the girl, raising her hand, held a black chip between her fingers and said that they had moved from darkness to light, but they still wanted to know more about them. The guy laughed in response and crossed his legs, saying that he didn't think that Waiwan would still remind him to be careful. Looking at her from under half-closed eyelids, he adjusted his glasses when the girl closed her eyes and said that it had come to the point that, from the point of view of the Eternal Club, various kinds of organizations and structures were not something worth fighting against. She added that they were better off focusing on creating a new world rather than worrying about someone else's nagging. The girl smiled softly when her boss noted that she had become more confident. They both turned to the side when a woman's voice came from the side. Lu Lai saw Yuki approaching them, who was dressed in a business suit and holding a clutch. She said that there was news from the laboratory, and then began to tell that Ishida and Professor Anthony had made new progress and were making it to demonstrate to the boss. Squinting his eyes, Mr. Liu smiled and agreed to go have a look, thinking that today was some kind of sensational day. From the mansion verse, Yuki could be heard suggesting that he change his clothes since they were going to the laboratory, which the guy immediately rejected, noting that it was not necessary. In the laboratory, he saw two black electronic bracelets with small screens. Ishida, with a wide smile on his face, said that these were energy balance bracelets designed by him personally. Lu Lai, accompanied by Waiwan and Yuki, leaned over the table with interest and asked about what energy balance is. The joyful Ishida beckoned them with his hand, inviting them to follow him. As everyone followed him through the high corridors, the old man said that when he was young, he discovered that the average person uses only 33% of his muscle mass. He turned to the others and smiled, adding that professional athletes are only able to use 42% and noted that this was very interesting. With one hand in his trouser pocket, Lu Lai lowered his eyes and adjusted his glasses with his free hand, noting that this was due to the fact that the electrical signals sent from the brain to the muscles weakened during the transmission process. He also noted that this means that the muscles are not able to fully receive the signal. Ishida silently looked at the boss for a couple of moments, and then suddenly rushed towards him, which surprised the guy. The scientist noted with admiration that Mr. Liu said everything correctly, and then asked if he was also studying this scientific field. Lu Lai started to mutter something in response. After some time, they watched the training of one of the fighters, who had suction cups attached to him for scanning. Ishida began to say that this is why they developed this bracelet. He said that by producing low-frequency electrical signals, it imitates the activity of neurons and also excites muscle tissue at rest. He imagined the muscular skeleton of a person in his head and continued to say that this bracelet increases the strength, endurance, speed, and flexibility of a person. He added that this can be called the first step of a person in becoming a Superman. While Lu Lai was looking at the small electronic bracelet in his hand with interest, Ishida walked up to the red pair with a smile on his face. "Mr. Liu asked, could such a small thing really do this?" The scientist in response to this asked if the boss wanted to test it himself, and noted that he had prepared a pair specifically for this. The two of them turned their heads upon hearing a woman scream and saw Yuki with her hand raised. The girl screamed joyfully that she wanted to try to give the boss the opportunity to voluntarily try it out. Having put on the bracelet, the secretary clenched her teeth, covered one eye and clenched her hands into fists. Lowering her head, she felt a flow of energy through her body and then suddenly opened her eyes. She thought she felt as if energy was permeating her entire body. Hitting the floor with her black heels, the girl quickly moved forward. When she walked up to the pair and hit it with her fist, there was a small explosion and it burst into all pieces. Yuki took a couple of steps back with a dumbfounded expression on her face when she saw what she had done to the pair. Turning towards her boss, she smiled nervously and pointed at the mess, asking if she would now have to make up for all this. Ishida smirked further when he saw Lu Lai's dumbfounded face with her mouth slightly open. The girl looked at the scientist when he began to say that an ordinary person is able to increase the activity of his muscles by 10–20%, however, judging by the punching bag. The corners of his lips pulled upward, and the old man himself threw a mysterious look at her, saying that the girl has a gift from nature. He said that a very bold idea came into his head. Standing to the side, Lu Lai crossed his arms and looked at Ishida with displeasure. He asked if it would be too much, to which he asked him to relax. With her hands folded behind her back, Yuki clenched her teeth and closed her eyes, asking how it came to this and is this normal. Opposite her at some distance stood Peng with a puzzled face. The girl turned in the other direction, covering her indignant face with her hand and quietly asking her boss if this was some kind of joke. She whispered that this guy was capable of twisting someone's wrist in an instant. Squinting his eyes, Lu Lai grinned, noting that Peng had a rather gentle character. Turning to the guy, he asked if this really is not a reason for a concession. He just closed his eyes and sighed quietly in response. Several people on the other side of the training field said that they were recording and it was time to start. Frowning her eyebrows, Yuki grimaced a little and said that in that case she would start first. Peng was surprised to see the girl begin to take off her heels. Then she rushed forward, raising her hand to strike. The guy with a puzzled face moved his head a little to the side, avoiding the attack. With an indifferent face, he again dodged another attack. Ishida watched with delight at the impromptu battle and how easily the guy avoided the girl's blows with increasing muscle activity. He opened his mouth wide in shock, wondering if a person without a bracelet was really capable of such a thing. Peng furrowed his eyebrows as he glanced at Yuki. He swung his fist, aiming a blow in her direction. Seeing this, the girl pulled back with fear in her eyes and then closed her eyes when the fist came extremely close. Taking sharp steps back, she screamed loudly and then saw Peng froze with his arm outstretched. Ishida froze in place with complete stunned eyes as the observers suddenly jumped out of their seats, telling him that this guy had just nearly hit, adding that he had surpassed the critical point of their data. Ignoring Yuki, who was crying in fear, the old man ran up to the young man, noting that he had managed to reach such a huge level. He asked if the guy would be able to occasionally look into their laboratory in the future. Watching the trainer's reaction, Lu Lai grinned contentedly, thinking that the bracelet could really increase a person's strength, but Peng's year-round time acceleration training and experience helped him win. Hanging his head, Mr. Liu raised the corners of his lips high, thinking about what would happen if these two forces were combined. The old man turned towards the boss, once praised his creation and asked whether it would be possible to provide such bracelets to all security. Ishida thought for a while, and then all three turned to the voice of a man who had entered the room. He laughed and said that this project was a waste of money, and it would not be possible to equip everyone with such bracelets. Anthony walked towards them with a wide smile on his face, one hand in his pocket. He said that yesterday this old man was complaining that each of these bracelets would cost $1 million. When the professor approached his mastered colleague, he, looking up at him, was indignant at the fact that he was sticking his nose into something that wasn't his own business. He added indignantly that the person who dilutes sake with water definitely shouldn't judge him. Anthony straightened his black tie with his hand and then smiled, saying that this is the difference between them, since his project is capable of endlessly bringing huge income to the Eternal Club. Ishida jerked when a pleased Mr. suddenly appeared next to him. Liu, saying that he should mend his relationship with the professor. Lu Lai and Weiwen walked through the huge room with equipment behind Anthony, who, with his arms outstretched in different directions, said that a superconducting battery would be much more promising than a material that stops blood, and that this project would cost the club billions. He said that he had previously discovered that if you rotate two-layer graphene at a magic angle, which is close to 1.1 degrees, then the two-layer graphene will become a superconductor. The professor stopped, with a pleased face, saying that if this technology is developed, then any device in the world will be able to save 2/3 of energy. Stopping behind him, Lu Lai and Weiwen looked ahead with dumbfounded faces. In front of them they saw a huge structure, two fields of which held a large golden disc in weightlessness. The professor said that although this project is still barely in its infancy, he has already dealt with the most difficult problems. He noted that all that remains is to simply step forward. Looking from under half-closed eyelids, Lu Lai adjusted his glasses and said that this was indeed a real money tree. Anthony jumped with joy when his boss said that he would then need to apply for a patent to create a superconductor company, and he would be very supportive. Weiwen looked at the guy as he turned in her direction with a smirk on his face and asked to contact the government on this occasion. He said he thought they would benefit greatly from this collaboration. Against the backdrop of the long winding roads near the coast, a man's voice was heard, saying that he didn't think they would react so quickly. Lu Lai sat in the back seat of a black Jeep, leaning his arm on the window partition. He said that apparently the idea of a superconducting battery was too attractive. Holding the laptop on his feet, through which he was talking with Weiwen, the guy waved his hand and asked to tell them that he was very glad to cooperate with such a high-class laboratory. He noted that first we need to wait for Professor Anthony's more detailed plan, and for now the girl must begin completing the following tasks. Closing the lid of the laptop, the guy threw it to the side on the seat. Peng, who was driving, looked at the boss through the front mirror and noted that the plan seemed to be going well. Lu Lai, whose hair was blown by the wind, leaned his head on his fingers and answered positively. He said that with room temperature superconductivity technology, they will be at least 30 years ahead of the rest of the world. Peng stopped in front of the entrance and a man outside, dressed in a business suit, began to show him the further direction of movement with his hands. The guy behind the wheel noted that the guys were very lucky to go to the base, and then added that it looked very peaceful here. Lu Lai put his head on his fist with a soft smile and said that these guys cannot even appreciate what they are risking their lives for. When the small ship set out to conquer the water surface, He said that this is only a small part of their great goal. He looked at the green land, thinking that the #1 World Creation Research Institute was located on a private island purchased by Jiang Sai. Looking at the fighters who stood near the cars, he thought that the purpose of his visit today was. Lu Lai, with his hands, smiled shyly and said that her brother was a fast learner. The girl sat opposite the man who was chewing bread and looking at him with interest, asked if he could tell about what happened then. He really interrupted the British, and the man asked if he didn't tell everything. Suddenly he turned towards the sound. Turning to the girl, Hull put a finger to his lips and hissed for her to be quiet. There was silence in the courtyard of the outbuilding. The girl called out to the man who headed towards the exit. He looked out the slightly open door and said that it looked like his location had been revealed. The girl asked, "What about Leon?" Hull peered out of the narrow crack with one eye and replied that she should not worry. It seemed quiet on the street. He must be safe, but they were probably being watched. Ashley screamed in alarm, saying that she would help the man distract them. He turned to the girl with a smile and told her not to do anything stupid. For her it would be suicide. She knitted her eyebrows pitifully, excitedly asking what to do. Sitting on the floor, she listened carefully to instructions that she and her family leave the city because they might be followed. With a determined look, Hull said that he would go to the east of the city and deal with them, and they should try to escape from the opposite side. The girl was worried and listened carefully to the man's reminder that under no circumstances should they go out onto the highway. The full moon was shining brightly in the sky above the city. The man ran quickly, jumping from roof to roof. The fugitive did not know that the muzzle of a gun was aimed behind his back. The soldier with a scarf over his face peered into the sight. Hull turned around as he ran, surprised to see a shot hit the roof next to him. 3 uniformed soldiers ran after him, telling each other to run faster. This bad man is there. The blonde hid behind the edge of the roof and looked out from cover. He extended his hand and fired, hitting one of the pursuers. A soldier with blonde, collected hair, pointing at the criminal, shouted to surround him and not give any mercy to the dirty dog, and in response he heard a cry of agreement. The soldier was surprised to hear a voice asking, "Did his mother say the same thing last night?" The guy and a girl were walking along the street of a small town in the light of a bright full moon. The man was holding a gold pocket watch in his hand. Yuki looked at the guy questioningly, saying that their target seemed to be in trouble right now. Wasn't he going to help him? Lu Lai looked contentedly, saying that this is a very interesting character. They will watch him first. Moreover, the time of his death has not yet come. A star was burning brightly in the sky with a full moon. Along the road, a white horse and rider galloped quickly among the hills. Hull turned around and said out loud that they had broken away from the pursuit. With a satisfied smile, he turned to the horse, saying that he runs well. His new friend must be glad that he stole him. Grinding flour is not at all suitable for him. The man turned around, noticing something behind him. He peered carefully at the hills. He didn't notice anything and frowned. Turning his body back, he still continued to look back. Suddenly, a bullet slips past his shoulder. Out of surprise, the man falls from his horse. Among the hills, figures of soldiers with guns appear. Hull, sitting up on the ground, swore. Suddenly, the horse grabbed the surprised man by the jacket, and with force he pulled the gasping man up, lifting him from the ground. Shaking its muzzle, the horse threw the man into the air, and he glanced back, checking that it was falling exactly on his back. Hull, stunned by what had happened, lay flat on his horse, facing backwards. Suddenly, his eyes flashing fiercely, the horse quickly rushed forward. Behind them came the screams of the pursuing soldiers, demanding to stop and telling each other to grab him. The alarmed man turned to the stallion, giving commands for him to speed up. The horse snorted, eyes sparkling, and the veins on its muzzle bulged from tension. With its rider screaming in fear, the horse jumped over the 3 soldiers in one fell swoop. The soldiers, who did not expect this, looked at him in surprise. Finally realizing, they shouted after the criminal that he was running away. One soldier pointed his finger at another, ordering him to light a fire to convey a message. With a loud stomp, the horse quickly ran forward. Hull grinned, saying that it looked like he now owed the horse a glass of beer, although judging by his character, he only drinks strong drinks. Suddenly the horse stopped abruptly, tucking its hind hooves and leaving a trail behind it so that the rider's nose hit it. Covering his nose with his hand, the man asked what happened. Why did he stop? The horse snorted and looked at him gloomily. The blond man with traces of blood on his face looked back in surprise. He leaned over, hugging the horse's neck, and asked, looking back, did he feel something? What was there? Suddenly, accompanied by a loud cry from the rider, the stallion galloped again. Riding among the hills, the man said that he had to admit that this was truly an amazing horse. The beast headed towards a tree in front, under which a small bush grew. The man said that this tree stood out too much, they could not hide here. But the horse simply began to chew the leaves of the bush. Grabbing the horse by the mane and ear, Hull shouted indignantly that he was making fun of him. They were on the run now. He would have understood if it had been a mare, but he was lured by a bush with berries, and he thought that the animal was as intelligent as a man. A guy and a girl stood on one of the hills and watched this scene. Yuki smiled, saying that this guy is strange. With a smile, he told Lulai, who chuckled, that the man did not look reliable. She looked at the guy, who replied that she thought he had real abilities. Looking at the man seriously, he continued that he was just a little unlucky. Hull squatted next to the horse, saying that he was probably too rude. He asked his friend if he was full, because they needed to run quickly. Looking at the horse chewing leaves, the man continued to reason that he must be alone. He knows that there is a herd of horses of an exotic breed. There is a very high demand for them. They are mestizos. Whoever arrives first will get it. He understands what he means. Suddenly, he turned around hearing his name. Tall military boots were approaching. The blonde military man said with a grin that it looked like he wasn't able to escape this time. Hull exhaled when he saw the armed soldiers surrounding him and asked the horse if he needed to eat right now. Now he will find a girlfriend in his next life. The soldier looked at him confidently, saying that there were no roofs or buildings here. The criminal had nowhere to run. Hull looked back defiantly and replied that they would see about that. Hull stood opposite a group of armed soldiers led by their blonde commander. He looked very seriously. The soldier, on the contrary, smiled. With a rough grin, the soldier ordered the man to kneel. The man looked scared. The soldiers pointed loaded guns at him and fired. The captain grinned evilly. Suddenly his look became very surprised. The horse was chewing grass, smoking bullets remained on the ground, and the man disappeared. The soldier screamed, asking where he was. The horse turned towards the tree amid the cries of the amazed soldiers, who shouted, asking where he had disappeared and whether everyone could see the horse. The commander stared in shock, thinking that this was impossible, absolutely impossible. He was sweating with excitement, thinking that it was impossible to dodge the bullets. One of the soldiers approached the horse from behind. He put his hand on the horse's croup. The man sighed dreamily, closing his eyes. The horse looked at him angrily, and he hit the impudent man with force with his hind hooves, throwing him back. The soldier's teeth flew out from the force of the blow to the face. The horse reared up, frightening the soldiers, who shouted that he was furious and that they should retreat quickly. Kicking hard, the horse scattered the screaming soldiers, and quickly rushed away. The surprised soldier told the commander that the hit soldiers had died. The commander clenched his teeth angrily, saying that these two were birds of a feather, and cursed. Turning to his subordinate, he growled that he was ordering them to be caught up immediately. Dawn began to be seen in the forest among the hills. The sun illuminated the treetops. Hull was sitting on one of the thick branches, thinking that he had almost died, but something was wrong. Stretching out his hand, he thought that those scoundrels could not have moved so slowly. His eyes widened in realization as the man realized that he was the one who had become faster. He remembered how quickly he ran away. Smirking, he dismissed the thought, deciding that it was nonsense. He thought that they had just gotten very drunk yesterday. Suddenly he turned towards the sound. His white horse with a fierce muzzle was rushing towards him. He stopped right under the tree where the man was sitting, and he suddenly plopped down right on his butt. The tramp of soldiers running up was heard. They stopped, surprised, saying, "Wait a minute, this is the same horse." They looked at the back of the sitting horse, wondering out loud what she was doing here and why she was sitting motionless. This was strange. The horse glanced sideways at them. With a sharp movement of his hoof, he hit the tree with force. The surprised soldier decided that she had gone mad again. But suddenly Hull fell from the branch from the blow. The commander saw him and shouted that it was Hull, ordering him to be captured. Suddenly, unexpectedly, a silhouette approached his face. The soldiers looked there in surprise. Illuminated Hull stood with a knife in his hand, and behind him lay the bodies of defeated soldiers. The man looked at his palm in surprise, thinking that no, it didn't seem to him. He really became very fast. What was happening to him? Yuki looked out from behind the tree and said that the man seemed scared. A gold pocket watch appeared. Lulai turned to the girl and said that he would get used to it. He only sped up time twice, something that he would have to face in the future. The guy looked at the determined blonde with a knife in his hand and concluded that this would be much crazier. The sun was rising over the small town. There was a gallows hanging on a wooden pole. The soldier was leading a girl whose legs were shackled. The girl's hands were tied behind her back and a bag was placed over her head. As she climbed the steps to the gallows, a soldier angrily shouted at her to go faster. The commander stood at the rope, spreading his arms to the sides, and said that he believed that he was speaking in a language understandable to everyone. Any harboring of a criminal automatically makes you an enemy of the British. Residents of the city, who were driven to watch the public execution, gloomily listened to the captain's words that it seemed that he had overestimated them, because they were the descendants of exiles and slaves. The blonde gloomily continued that they don't know what gratitude is at all. He turned gloomily. A bag was torn from the girl's head. It was Ashley. The residents repeated her name in fear, recognizing her. The captain looked at them angrily, telling them to see what happens to traitors. He put a rope around the girl's neck. Turning gloomily to his subordinates, he gave the order to finish with her. Hull threw the gun aside, and then he took aim with the second one. The second soldier flew far back, hit by a bullet. Hull quickly turned around, and he raised his hand with the pistol. His eyes widened in surprise. The captain chuckled, saying that the man was actually capable of dodging bullets. Holding Ashley, who was screaming in fear, at gunpoint, he asked with a grin if she was capable of this. Hull shouted in shock that he should not do this. The captain looked at him with a grin and said that, to put it bluntly, either the man would die or she would die. An armed soldier appeared on the roof behind the blonde and asked what he would choose. The soldier in the headscarf took aim while the captain asked if the man knew what his biggest problem was, demonstrating his courage and fearlessness. The muzzle was aimed, and the man continued that this pathetic heroism never leads to good. A shot rang out and Hull arched back, screaming and dropping his gun. The sound of a gunshot rang out over the rooftops. Hull looked up in surprise. The gloomy and confident expression on the captain's face gave way to surprise. The townspeople turned around, looking back in surprise. The soldier standing on the roof of the building with a gun staggered and fell down. With a loud thud, he fell headfirst to the ground. The captain asked in astonishment what was happening, and Ashley, standing at the gallows, was also surprised. Around the corner of one of the houses stood the figure of a man with a gun. One of the residents looked sternly at the captain. Hull turned around and thanked the man named Leon with a smile. Ashley covered her eyes from the loud scream of the captain, who shouted that they dared to shoot at a British soldier and called everyone non-entities. Hull rushed forward with blazing eyes. The head of the soldier grabbed the girl, pinching her neck with his forearm. Suddenly, a fast Hull ran at him, who literally knocked the gun out of his hand, grabbing the frightened girl in his arms. Lot of impact, the captain's entire face was crushed with a dislocated jaw. With a crash, he fell to the floor. The captain stood up, blood running down his face. He turned his head, looking at the man. Hull stood on the gallows platform, confidently holding a surprised Ashley in his arms. The soldiers and townspeople looked at him in surprise. The city men discussed it in surprise, saying that this is Hull, its speed is great, how is this possible? The bloodied captain turned around after hearing his words. Hull shouted angrily, addressing the townspeople with words that they were turning their houses into hell, these bad people were taking their crops. Were they really born to become slaves? Residents listened in surprise to the man's words that they were humiliating their wives and daughters. Hull placed the girl next to him and said loudly that resistance had already begun in the north, how long would they hide? The men listened to the words about taking up arms, while God was with them. He called them all together, and the residents repeated in surprise, did he say God? Hull shouted furiously, calling for the invaders to be sent to hell. The captain leaned on his hand as he stood up and said that they were all crazy. He shouted angrily with all his might, ordering the soldiers to shoot and kill them all. The soldiers raised their guns, aiming at the people. The residents looked at them in shock. Hull thought intensely that there were too many targets, he wouldn't make it in time. He quickly ran, thinking that he needed to stop them. Shots rang out from all the guns. Hull looked amazed as he ran up. Suddenly all the residents froze, as if covered in a black and white filter. The man stopped in surprise and asked what was happening. He looked up in surprise. The silhouette of a man in glasses descended in the sky in a radiance, holding out his hand. Lulai smiled contentedly and, exhaling, said that he had time. With a stomp, his feet touched the ground and Yuki landed next to him. They stood opposite the man who recoiled from them in shock. Shocked, he asked who they were. Yuki, who was standing behind the boss, translated, saying that he was the one who was helping him. Lulai looked at him and said that at the same time he was testing him, he hoped that the man would not mind. The brunette calmly looked at his interlocutor, saying that he was very impressed with his fighting skills, observation and leadership qualities, and said that he had the talent that he needed. Hull looked sideways silently. Bullets froze in the air, and he said this was also the result of his help. Lulai slightly bowed his head and asked if the man wanted to become the king here. Hull looked at him in surprise. He looked down thoughtfully and said nothing. Then he raised his head and began to say that he. Lulai looked at him from under his glasses, anticipating. Hull looked at him decisively and finished by saying that he refused. Pursing his lips, Lulai looked at Hull with a puzzled face when he heard his refusal. Coming closer to him, the blond man smiled, put his hands behind his head and said that if he wanted to recruit someone, then he better go north. Corners of lips, Mr. Liu stretched out in a satisfied grin when the man with a scar on his face, smiling, said that he was just an ordinary deserter and was not suitable at all. He froze in surprise when Lulai asked what does an ordinary deserter mean. The guy looked at him with a sly look, saying that he once led a protest and even burned down the colonists' warehouse, noting that this was definitely not an ordinary deserter. When Hull heard these words, his eyes opened wide. Lulai lowered his eyes and looked at his palm sparkling with bright light, above which a moment later a golden pocket watch appeared. He said he had done a lot of preparation before looking for it. The man with a scar on his face was shocked when he saw the huge dial. As the city's skyline began to change, Mr. Liu smiled contentedly, noting that this was not all idle chatter. Hull froze, raising his well-fed gaze upward, and drops of cold sweat flowed down his face profusely. He cast a frightened glance to the side. In that direction he saw the silhouette of a man with a torch in his hands, and, looking closer, he recognized himself in this man. He wondered if it was really him. He froze in place with his mouth open and eyes wide, thinking that it was him only a few months ago. The man turned to Lu Lai as he told him that he was a time merchant who traveled through centuries. Pulling a good grin on his face, the guy began to say that if the deserter wanted, he could show him the whole story of his life, noting that everyone who passes through time leaves traces. He looked at the gloomy crowd of people in the square, saying that due to mistrust caused by the increase in taxes, he personally led the merchants and workers, after which they together burned the governor's warehouse. The guy watched his Hull, with a grim face, release the torch from his hands, getting wet, from which he, along with the rest of the people, stood and watched the fire in the warehouse. The scarred man lowered his head and pursed his lips into a thin line as he listened to the merchant's offer to temporarily continue his illustrious career in the north. Covering his eyes, Lu Lai told him that he could become a leader and strategist. He looked up at him with his stern gaze and asked that maybe he wanted to end up here, being just a fugitive. Without raising his gaze, Hull calmly asked whether he would be of any use. Looking at him from under his brows, the guy grinned and asked if he would regret such a life. The scarred man with a gloomy face replied that he was just an insignificant person, and the greatest contribution he made was. He sat down on the stairs next to one of the buildings and lowered his head, saying that this contribution was just some kind of sabotage, and in comparison with all the great figures, his ideals are simply ridiculous. Remembering himself sitting in a flowing cloak on the signs of the establishment, he began to say that he always firmly believed that God is the same to all people, but if someone deprives their freedom, then he frowned and pursed his lips, ending his thought with the words that they can only return her themselves. Hull recalled how, with his hands on the table, he stood surrounded by others like himself, saying that he would meet many people, and they were all fighting for the right to be free. Looking up, the scarred man said that he gradually began to understand that the freedom he wanted. Lu Lai crossed his arm over his chest as Hull remembered the displeased, cruel faces of his allies, noting that this freedom was different from the one they wanted. He noted that even though they fought together, they fought together. Looking into their gloomy eyes, the man understood that for them, slaves. He lowered his head and agreed that slaves still remained slaves, and nothing had changed. Holding his arms crossed on his chest, Lu Lai closed his eyes and said that on such a small scale, it is difficult to sense changes. He added that the man was now a wanted criminal. Looking at him with a satisfied look with a slight smile on his face, he asked what was stopping him from accepting his offer. He said that he then had the opportunity to build his own state, according to his ideals, which would differ from the ideals of great figures. Clasping his hands, Hull, without raising his head, said that he did not know what kind of god this guy was. However, he apparently knew very little about people. Throwing a frown at him, he opened his mouth and asked how to build your state in such a short time. He added that he had absolutely no confidence in this matter. Lu Lai waved his hand and pressed his back against the wall, noting that the man had excellent leadership qualities. He said that's why he found it. The man with the scar grimaced in surprise and wide-eyed and wondered when the time trader, with a smirk on his face and darkened eyes, said that he also had time to invest in it. The corners of Lu Lai's lips curled up, and a smile stretched across his face as he talked about giving a man 200 years and his task. While Hull listened to his words, cold sweat flowed down his face, and in shock was visible in his eyes. The excuse of time said that his task would be to create a free state on this land, adding that he would also have to secretly help the wallpaper and find talents among them. Covering his eyes, the guy smiled sweetly and asked him not to worry, noting that time is not a problem at all. The blonde Briton looked at the floor with empty, frightened eyes, and blood flowed from his nose and mouth in small streams. Stuttering after each word, he noted that that man was faster than a bullet. While he continued to repeat this, a man with a gun in his hand was holding him by the scruff of the neck. In an irritated voice, he asked if the Briton had really gone crazy and started talking to himself. He loudly ordered him to get up from the ground. The man with a smile on his face turned to his ally Leon, who, holding a gun in his hand, was sitting on the gallows, and said that it seemed that this pig had completely gone crazy. Leon replied that he and his comrades should be put in a pigsty, noting that Mr. Hull would then decide what to do with them. He turned to a bald man named Ma and asked what they should do with the spoils. He added that it was impossible to store bullets and gunpowder in his family's warehouse, since everything would become damp there and disappear. Ma responded by loudly telling him to shut up, noting that this was an order from Mr. Hull himself. At this moment, Hull stood on a hill overlooking the city. Holding his hands in his pockets, he smiled contentedly. The man glanced back when he heard a familiar voice saying that this seemed to be his first solid profit. Lu Lai, accompanied by Yuki, approached him and asked if he had decided to stay. When they all caught up, the man with a scar on his face answered contentedly that now that everyone had begun to actively resist, It was unlikely that anyone would want to support the colonists. Mr. Liu agreed with a soft smile and then glanced at the man as he asked him not to worry. Hull smiled widely and folded his arms across his chest, noting that he wanted to continue his journey to the south as he wanted to see the continent united. Looking at the view from above, Lu Lai put his hand into his pants pocket, believing that he already had certain plans for the future. He asked him to trust his heart and take action. Hull's eyes showed a little fear as Mr. Liu turned his gaze to him and said in a serious voice that, however, he was not finished with him yet. Looking at him sideways, the guy noted that when all the dust settles, he should remember their agreement. Holding his arms crossed over his chest, the scarred man grinned, and then, looking up with confidence, stated that there was no need to worry about this since he would keep his word, because in the end, raising his head, he saw the mark of his life, which stated that Stephen Hull had 246 years, 11 months, 4 days, 15 hours, 3 minutes, and 12 seconds to live. He waved his hand, looking at Lu Lai, and noted that what he told him about the future meant that divisions and conflicts would still exist even though they lay the foundation of history here. The time trader closed his eyes and lowered his head as the man asked if their efforts would not be in vain if conflicts did not disappear in the future. The guy straightened his shoulders and raised his head, noting that this question has already been rethought by humanity many times, however, so far he cannot answer it. He added that, however, when they see him again. Hull froze with a puzzled face when Mr. Liu noted that he was confident that he would find the answer to this question himself and be satisfied with it. Lu Lai waved his hand, and a gold pocket watch appeared above it, after which the guy's body was illuminated with a bright light. He said goodbye to the man, noting that they would see each other soon. Left alone, Hull looked at the blue sky with many white clouds. Without taking his eyes off him, he pursed his lips. When they broke into a satisfied grin, he also said goodbye to Mr. Liu. A guy and a girl walked through a space strewn with many golden dials. Yuki looked towards her boss and asked where they would go this time. As many small green spheres appeared around them, Lu Lai smiled and noted that since they had already studied martial arts, it was time for them to immerse themselves in science. He approached one of the spheres, and it glowed with a bright light. In it, he saw an image of a man with brown hair, dressed in a black suit, and noted that they were going to him. Looking at the image, he began to say that he. At this moment, the guy with frightened eyes turned back after Yuki outlasted him with her loud scream. A girl with round eyes and an open mouth nervously said that she knew this man. Imagining a dark silhouette in her head, she lowered her head and said that it was Ampere, and that he described the electrodynamic theory. She added that she had seen him on the cover of a physics textbook. Pursing her lips, the girl with dumbfounded eyes thought that at that time she had spent a lot of effort studying physics, and now she had such a chance. With a nervous smile and a tense face, a vein bulging on her forehead, she turned to her boss and loudly began to ask whether she would really see him real and alive. Standing near the bright light, Lu Lai looked at the girl and asked her to keep up with him, since he did not want to look for her ossified remains. Lowering his head, he smiled and began to adjust his glasses, noting that since she was so inquisitive. Keeping one hand in his pocket, he raised the other up, after which a huge golden dial appeared. He said that they would definitely meet. When they moved around France in the late 18th, early 19th centuries and saw cityscapes, Mr. Liu agreed that they would meet with this big shot. While all the houses were immersed in the darkness of the night, a light was burning in one of the windows of the huge building. Leaning over the table, the student slammed his fist on the tabletop, indignantly noting that nothing was working out for him. He wondered if there could be an error in his formula. Touching his notes with one hand, he leaned his head on the other and cursed in French. He noted that if everything had to be done all over again, then all those days would have been wasted. When a bright light came on behind him, the man, without looking up from the table, said that he would need to look into the key sequence because, perhaps, it would still be possible to fix everything. Too Glowing was immersed in his notes. He noted out loud that everything in these places was correct and he needed to look further. The girl leaned to the side and waved her hand, trying to attract his attention, but the scientist did not react at all. With a smile on his face, he loudly exclaimed that he had found a mistake and would not have to start over. Turning to Lu Lai, who stood with a dissatisfied face and arms crossed over his chest, Yuki covered her mouth with her hand and quietly noted that he did not pay any attention to them. The guy irritably noted that this was the first time something like this had happened to him. The girl with a puzzled face lowered her eyebrows and said that although he is known for his hard work, however, this is too much. Looking at him, Mr. Liu pursed his lips, noting that all these people famous in ancient times are too strange. They jerked in shock and froze, wide-eyed, when a man's voice loudly ordered them to be silent. Bending over the table, Ampere, without turning his head in their direction, said that he didn't care whether they were ghosts or vampires. The main thing was that they didn't touch him now. He added that he would talk to them when he finished working. Lu Lai looked at his subordinate with a puzzled expression as she waved her hands and smiled nervously, answering in French that she didn't mind and were willing to wait. At that moment, the scientist with an angry face turned in her direction and loudly shouted that she was ignorant. Pursing his lips, Mr. Liu closed his eyes and thought that it would definitely not be easy with this difficult personality, and he didn't know where this meeting would lead. Looking at the frowning boss with his arms crossed on his chest, Yuki whispered that they could. The irritated guy did not let her finish and loudly snapped his fingers, using time acceleration. Raising his hands, Ampere stretched with a smile on his face, noting in French that he had done everything perfectly. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly, noting that he was very tired. The man took out his pocket watch while saying that it was probably time for breakfast. Seeing the current time, he was shocked and his eyes widened. The scientist exclaimed loudly, asking why it was only 1 in the morning. With a sweaty face, he said that it felt like the whole night had passed, and he definitely couldn't get the job done so quickly. The man looked at the dark silhouettes of his night guests. The guy and the girl remained silent when Ampere, turning in their direction, asked who they were. Fear began to be read in the teacher's eyes when Lu Lai smiled predatorily and said that everything was correct, because if you count according to ordinary time, then the whole night had indeed passed. Smiling sweetly, Yuki decided to intervene in the conversation and began to say what her boss wanted to tell him. Mr. Liu perked up a little when the scientist said that he understood everything. However, after a moment, the man's face darkened with fear, and he said that they were ghosts. In one of the estates of the night city, which was illuminated by bright moonlight, one could hear a curse in French, and that ghost had come to the man. When Ampere jumped up from his seat, knocking over his chair, Yuki put her hands forward with a worried face and was caught explaining that they didn't want to hurt him. The man reached out with a trembling hand to the jar of ink, shouting at them not to come near him. Screaming, he raised his hand and threw a bottle towards the night guests. Lu Lai shot his eyes, after which the container hovered in the air. Looking at her with stunned eyes, the scientist asked how she could just freeze. Having fallen to the floor, he leaned on his hands and in a frightened voice asked the guy if he was Cronus himself, and then asked why he needed him. Looking down at Ampere, Lu Lai straightened his tie with a satisfied grin on his face and said that he was not some fictional god, but just a time trader traveling through the centuries. The scientist was confused when Mr. Liu looked at him from under his brows, holding a frozen jar of ink in his hand, and said that for his sake he went through time and space. The man hesitantly asked why because of him. He looked at a girl in a business suit who approached him and addressed him. His eyes widened when Yuki grinned and said that it was an invitation from the future. With a frightened face, Ampere repeated her words and asked what does this mean. Lu Lai and the girl grinned at the same time, and Yuki began to say that her boss wanted to say that his knowledge was greatly admired by people, and if he managed to live long enough, he would be able to make much greater contributions to science. Rising from the floor, the scientist pointed a finger at himself and asked if they were really talking about him. He closed his eyes and patted himself on the head, saying that he was just an ordinary mathematics teacher, and they wouldn't even let him into the Royal Academy. Lowering his eyes, the man touched his chin with his hands and said that, in addition, there are certain requirements to status and origin, so in this matter, mere aspiration is not enough. The guy and girl looked at him with puzzled faces, pursing their lips. Lu Lai noted that he ignored the longevity condition, and Yuki added that he was a little paranoid. The scientist turned around with his arms crossed, having heard someone say that he needed to believe in himself more. He was asked whether he was really going to stand still all his life. Mr. Liu smiled when Ampere jerked forward and asked in surprise whether he understood correctly that they were silent about him becoming a great mathematician. Standing behind the guy, Yuki intervened in the conversation and said that her boss rather meant that his place was not exactly here. The scientist froze with his mouth slightly open and asked what she meant. Lu Lai grinned and raised his hand to himself and asked in French to look at it. The guy snapped his fingers. A drop of sweat ran down the frightened face of the man with round eyes. A small green sphere flew up to him, in which he saw a modern metropolis from a bird's eye view. The guy and the girl frowned at him with satisfied grins, while the scientist's face showed shock and confusion. He looked at the huge towers and the plane flying over the city. Then he saw modern people looking at their phone screens. Ampere looked at the changing images with his mouth wide open and his eyes wide open and said that he simply could not believe it. Yuki folded her hands on her back and said with a small smile that these joys reflect key moments in the future where he will have to show his ideas to the whole world. The scientist could not tear his shocked gaze away from the images, noting that the future was simply unimaginable. The girl closed her eyes and lowered her head, saying that he would not be the only person invited to the Temple of Time. She asked him to introduce. The man lowered his head, listening not to the words that he would be able to work with great historical figures who made enormous contributions to science. She added that this alone should be enough to impress him. Arching one eyebrow, Ampere asked with interest whether he could really work even with the fathers of mathematics. Looking intently at his dumbfounded face, Lu Lai crossed his arms over his chest and at the same time as Yuki answered him in the affirmative, adding that if he himself wants it. The girl smiled and said that everything can come true. With a darkened gaze and a sly grin on her face, she looked at the scientist, who still could not come to his senses after what had happened. She asked if he agreed to join them. Lowering his empty eyes, the man froze and noted that they had been joking for a long time, and then asked questions about the future and the possibility of seeing other people. He turned sharply to his overnight guests and loudly shouted indignantly that he could never refuse such a thing. Nodding contentedly, Lu Lai extended his hand and noted in French that this was simply wonderful. Yuki said with a smile that now her boss will add 200 years to his life and he will be contacted in the future. Hearing about so many years of life, the scientist was stupefied. The girl added that for now he could enjoy longevity, and the guy said that he could consider it a privilege of his employees. Lu Lai grinned and waved his hand, causing a small glowing ball to appear above his palm, and then he extended his hand forward. The scientist twitched when he was engulfed in light, after which information appeared above him that André-Marie Ampère had 38 years, 11 months, 4 days, 12 hours, and 50 seconds to live. Flashing his glasses, Lu Lai furrowed his eyebrows and cast his gaze at him. Yuki told him to take his time with an indifferent face. The guy looked with a satisfied grin as the numbers in the remaining Ampère time changed with great speed. A bright white light completely engulfed the man, lifting his feet off the floor. A few moments later, Lu Lai leaned forward with a shocked face. He saw that all the indicators of the remaining time remained the same, with the exception that only 2 years of schooling had been added. Sharply turning his stunned face in his direction, he wondered why only 2 years. He wondered if Ampère was lying on the floor, propped up with one hand and holding his head with the other, noting that his head was very dizzy. Mr. Lu thought it was as if something had stopped him. His pupils constricted and his mouth opened in surprise. He wondered if this was the wrong person. The guy looked with a shocked look at the incomprehensible scientist who was rubbing his head. He wondered if something had stopped him while trying to rewind time. He thought that he had never encountered anything like this before. Lowering his eyes, Lu Lai touched his chin with his hands and tried to understand what the problem was. He wondered if even he could not resist this force. He looked blankly and clenched his teeth when space began to distort. The frightened Parka turned back. He saw Yuki kneeling in front of Ampère, who had lightning circling around his body and screaming loudly. He asked with concern what was happening. With fear in his eyes, the time trader rushed forward and shouted to his subordinate, telling her not to touch him. Yuki walked away from the man with a gloomy face, and the boss covered her with his hand. He said that time had a strange effect on his body, and it was possible that a backlash might occur. The girl asked him what this meant. Lu Lai watched with wide eyes as the scientist's body convulsed as bright lightning sparked around him. The man suggested that this electric current must be creating a barrier to his time. He noted that apparently Mr. Lu is too low a power level to resist this current. The guy thought about what low level means. Lowering his eyebrows, he frowned and began to think that just as mountains have different heights, so do people, and if we talk about the successes of Ampère in the history of mankind, then it was he who stood at the origins of electrodynamics. Anticipating how the drawings were changed into microcircuits, he thought that all subsequent generations were guided by his research, which influenced all further achievements in the future. Pursing his lips, Lu Lai with an irritated look imagined the dark silhouette of a scientist in his head, and thought that although he was not the only one who worked in this direction, however, if we talk about his level, then he can certainly be called a great figure. While Ampère, sitting on the floor, looked at his hands, the girl turned her calm face to her boss and screamed loudly, asking what should they do. Scientists noted that he doesn't seem to be in pain now. Covering his eyes, Mr. Lu sighed and then put his hand forward, using time transfer again. Time, like an arrow, flew towards the man. As she approached him, it was as if an invisible dome had been created around him, from which time jumped in the other direction. Holding his hand in the air, Lu Lai looked at him with a blank face, thinking that he seemed to be really well protected. He thought that if he wanted to get such a great figure, looking at the frightened scientist, from whom he asked what they wanted to do with him, Mr. Lu thought that he would have to pay a much higher price than he expected. The corners of the young man's lips turned up, and he said that since everything turned out this way. Yuki turned to her boss with a sad, gloomy face and quietly asked if it could be that they were now facing a ghost. The guy replied that now with her look she reminds him of a ghost much more. Looking at the puzzled Ampère, he crossed his arms and proudly said that she need not worry since her idol will not die. He noted that, apparently, the other side was not satisfied with the price he proposed. Arching one eyebrow, Yuki glanced towards the boss and asked who was on the other side. Shock appeared on her face and her eyes widened as Mr. Lu replied with a soft smile that this is the very law of time. The man on the floor looked at them with a puzzled look, thinking that he did not understand at all what language they were speaking in, and that he had a bad feeling about all this. With his brows furrowed, Lu Lai flashed his glasses and grinned, saying that everything is obvious, since Mr. Ampère is different from other figures, and time seems to attach great importance to him. Looking at Mr. Lu, Yuki asked if it turns out that the law of time wants to stop them. Raising one corner of his lips, the time trader calmly replied that this was not entirely true. With a satisfied face and crossed arms, he turned to his subordinate and said that it was increasingly looking like the law of time wanted to hold an auction. Pursing her lips, the girl looked at him with widened eyes with a puzzled look. Lu Lai, his glasses flashing, looked at the pocket watch in his palm and said that it was time to find out what was going on. He looked at the dial of the watch in his hand, saying that he was wondering what trump cards time had hidden up his sleeve. A bright yellow light shone through the lenses of his glasses as he pressed the button. The hand of the pocket watch began to move at great speed. After a moment, Yuki looked around, alone in the room. She wondered where her boss and Mr. Ampere had gone. She screamed loudly, saying goodbye to leaving her here alone because she wouldn't even be able to find a job. In the temporary space strewn with clock dials, a bright light erupted. Among the white light, Lu Lai appeared with his eyes closed. He opened his narrowed eyes and looked at the space in front of him. A bright light shone around the guy, everything was strewn with stars. Raising his eyes, he saw Ampere, who was in a large green sphere. In a frightened voice, the scientist asked in French what was happening now and asked for help. Looking at him with calm eyes, Mr. Liu replied that this was a temporary measure. He turned around in surprise when he heard a sound behind him. From a large yellow dial on the floor came many small green spheres. A massive light silhouette with horns on its head and rings around its wrists began to appear from the watch. Flashing his glasses, Lu Lai turned in that direction and noted that it was very good that he was doing a conversation. He stood in front of a huge creature along whose long body the universe was depicted, and above his shoulders there were two golden dials. The guy said that he was ready to join him. He raised his head up, looking at the creature, and invited the Time Lord to talk. Looking at his shining eyes, he grinned, showing his teeth, and said that he needed that person. After that, he looked at the terrified face of the scientist in the sphere. The Time Lords bowed their heads. Looking at him with a steady, calm gaze, Lu Lai asked him to name his price. The creature moved its hand to the side, and a glowing ball appeared above it. The hand on one of the dials began to glow, and the bright light began to expand. While his hair was blowing in the air, Mr. Liu looked at the approaching flash with a frown on his face. There he saw Ampere giving a speech in the future, how he communicates with other scientists and lies contentedly in a pile of papers. Ampere pressed herself against the wall of the sphere with a dumbfounded face, asking if it was him. He asked what kind of witchcraft this is. Lu Lai answered with crossed arms that this is not magic at all. The scientist froze, eyes wide open, when Mr. Liu added with a grin that it was just time. As the Time Lord waved his large arms, behind him, many hands on dials were spinning at high speed. The creature cast a sharp glance towards the guy, which made him confused. His body stopped obeying and began to rise upward. The Time Lord looked at how the guy's body caught up with him. A bright flash appeared from his chest and began to push Lu Lai aside. The young man pursed his lips into a stripe and closed one eye, trying to understand what this strong pressure was. His mouth dropped open and his eyes widened as he realized it was time. Suddenly, the glass of his glasses began to crack. Parquet began to grin, wondering if this powerful force was the price offered by the Time Lord. Raising his gaze to him, he thought that, apparently, the ruler attaches very great importance to the future achievement of this man, and if so. His eyebrows frowned, and a satisfied grin spread across his face when he thought that he simply had to show the firmness of his intentions. A golden pocket watch appeared in Lu Lai's palm, and he thought that in negotiating. A huge dial appeared behind him, and he put his hand forward, finishing the thought that he was a professional in negotiations. The hand on his watch began to spin at great speed. A huge golden lightning bolt healed the dial. The energy streams of the Time Lord and Lu Lai collided together, forming a golden flash. Pursing his lips, the guy looked at the creature with a frown. The numbers for the remainder of his life began to change rapidly. Lu Lai continued to stand with his arm outstretched, watching what was happening with crazy eyes and a stupid smile. He thought that apparently he wouldn't be able to get this person so easily. He thought that he would find out how great the master's appetite is. As they both continued to sow bright light, Mr. Liu, with wild eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, mentally telling the creature to take as much of his time as he wanted. With a sly face, he lifted the corner of his lips as the light grew closer to him. When the light almost completely covered him, he furrowed his brows. All alone, Yuki sat on the table and telepathically kicked. She exhaled noisily and noted that a gray minute had already passed. She wondered how long she would have to stay here. There was a noise and her boss and Ampere appeared in the room. The girl with a joyful face turned towards Lu Lai with a smirk on her lips and loudly noted that they were finally back. Looking down, the guy reached out with his hand to his broken glasses. He said that he had an amazing experience, and as for the scientist, he looked at the unconscious man lying on the floor and noted that 200 years of his life had cost him hundreds of thousands of commissions. When Yuki heard this, her face darkened and her lower jaw sank down. She indignantly shouted that these were huge losses and asked whether this was too high a price. Taking off his glasses, Lu Lai lowered his eyes and walked past the worried assistant with a soft smile. He said everything was fine and it was just an investment. He then noted that it was time for them to leave. The girl asked if they would leave so easily. Looking at Mr. Ampere on the floor, she asked how they could leave without saying goodbye, because what if the scientist thought that he dreamed? Mr. Liu furrowed his eyebrows and raised his head upward when his biological clock appeared above him. Lu Lai added that the price was truly colossal, although the numbers were frightening. However, otherwise he would not have been able to obtain the bottomless pit of time. The protagonist straightened his shoulders and looked towards Yuki with a malicious grin. He asked his assistant who was next in their plans. Yuki began to fuss and take out a piece of paper with a list of goals from her inner jacket pocket. Yuki said that she will look now because she has everything written down. Yuki held a paper with names in her hands and followed forward Lu Lai, who walked proudly through the temporary light space. Yuki replied that next in line was alternating current researcher Faraday, next in line was chemist Dmitry Ivanovich, and next was electromagnetism researcher Orsted. Lu Lai sighed with relief and raised his head up. He understood that all these people were outstanding figures and they would require a lot of time for themselves. Lu Lai continued to follow his path and thought that he had to approach the choice rationally, otherwise it would be bad. With his shoulders back wide and his hands in his pockets, Lu Lai looked ahead with a mocking expression as Yuki stood timidly and shyly behind him. Lu Lai noted with irony that Yuki mentioned chemistry, but he thought it would be worthwhile to focus on electricity for now. The protagonist sarcastically turned back towards Yuki, who was looking at him questioningly. Lu Lai noted that it was first necessary to deal with the branch of technology for directing electricity. Yuki asked about the list they had. Lu Lai looked forward to his adventures. He noted with irony that there was to be a continuation. Lu Lai tilted his head and sarcastically cast his gaze towards Yuki. The silhouettes of Yuki and Lu Lai's legs stood not far from the table where a man with glasses was sitting. The sign to be continued was crossed out. Under the scrutiny of the law of time and due to the correction of historical lines, Lu Lai was forced to spend a huge amount of time making deals with great figures of science. The main character and Yuki were on a provincial street from one of the eras of the past, where a whole crowd of people was wandering along the street. Lu Lai continued to gather people from his list and used his hand with the skills of time and absorbed one of the prominent scientists of that time. Lu Lai understood that now the expenses exceeded hundreds of thousands. However, witnessing the creation of an entire scientific industry was the most unique experience in the whole world. The protagonist frowned caustically and tilted his head forward, looking ahead sarcastically. The old village of a bygone era was located high in the mountains under the rays of a warm sunny day. The black silhouettes of Lu Lai and Yuki were under the huge and dense foliage of a tree against the backdrop of sunlight. They moved to July 10, 1857. The main character broke into an ironic smile. He moved to the day when the last of the list of outstanding scientists was supposed to be born. Who he needed. Lu Lai peered out gloatingly from under his long bangs, his eyebrows furrowed caustically. A cart with wooden wheels rolled along the cold ground. A man in a brown plaid suit worriedly held his pregnant wife, who was having contractions. He told his wife Juka to hold on, because they would soon be in the hospital. The man frantically tried to help his wife, who was having painful contractions. Juka's husband noted that she was already a mother of 3 children, and this time everything should have gone well. Writhing in pain, Juka screamed that this time she was in great pain. A carriage with an old driver drove past a huge dark fortress. Juka's husband asked the driver from the carriage how long they still had to go, because Juka was barely holding on. The driver in the black hat said that they didn't have much time left. A large carter with white canvas and large wooden wheels was driving in a small alley with a stone road. Yuki looked out from around the corner with an amazed look and examined the situation with the person they needed, who was about to be born. Yuki turned to her master Lu Lai and said that she noticed the right people and it looked like the woman was having a difficult birth. The main character leaned his body against the wall and closed his eyes with a feeling of cordiality as the horse in the cart ran as fast as he could. Lu Lai noticed that a great man would be born and it would not be possible without difficulties. Lu Lai put his hands in his pockets and began to walk forward as Yuki continued to hide behind the wall. Lu Lai told Yuki to follow him. Yuki asked where they should go. The main character turned back and broke into an ironic smile. He noticed that they needed to do a small favor. Yuki widened her eyes and opened her mouth upon hearing her boss's statement. Lu Lai said that he did not need stillborn employees. Yuki didn't believe that Lu Lai said that they would deliver the baby. Yuki replied that she would rather remain silent. The woman squirmed in pain and screamed throughout the space. She screamed that she couldn't take it anymore. Juka's husband lay with her eyes closed and clenched her teeth as her husband shouted to the cab driver about how long they still had to go. The silhouettes of Yuki and Lu Lai were on the roof of a high, huge fortress and were watching the cart. Yuki screamed impatiently that Juka was already at her limit and they needed to hurry to help. Lu Lai raised his eyebrows and looked forward disdainfully as he took out his golden magic glowing watch. The carriage and the horse ran faster. The horse's long mane fluttered in the wind from its fast speed. Lu Lai looked forward expressively and intensely through the magical aura of the clock. The hands of the gold watch began to spin at a fast speed. The black silhouette of a horse was frozen in time. The cart came under the influence of Lu Lai's magical time management skill and glowed with a bright aura. Lu Lai looked sarcastically towards Yuki and sarcastically said that there was nothing to thank him for since he did everything wisely. A large white fortress with a dense front garden in the courtyard. The glowing silhouettes of Yuki and Lu Lai appeared in the dark space inside the fortress. The main character and his assistant walked along a dark corridor and heard loud screams. Yuki, with concern on her face, followed her master, whose confidence was very high. Yuki was shocked by the loud screams and she asked Lu Lai about how Juka's difficult birth and possible consequences could affect the story. Lu Lai told Yuki not to worry with a satisfied expression. The protagonist broke into a malicious smile and looked sarcastically towards Yuki. He reminded Yuki that he said that everything that happened in history was a fait accompli. Therefore, Lu Lai added that the mother and child would be fine. A court maid in a black cape ran through the door with a basin of warm water for the birth. From the sidelines, other labor assistants told Juka to push and breathe deeper, shouting that someone had urgently brought hot water. Lu Lai noticed that they had a saying, "Heaven always places great responsibilities on great people." Juka squirmed in pain and screamed as she lay on her bed. Lu Lai noted that such people were destined to remain in history. He also suggested that even time itself will show such people the simplest path through life. On the small veranda, Juka's husband was sitting on a bench, waiting. In anticipation, Juka's husband touched his nose and abruptly jumped up and turned to the side when he heard that his wife had given birth. The court maid walked down the wooden stairs and waved her arms. She shouted that Juka gave birth to a boy. Juka's husband walked up the stairs closer to the maid. Convulsively, Juka's husband spread his arms to the sides and asked if everything was all right with his wife. He was going to see her. The black silhouettes of Yuki and the main character stood aside and watched what was happening. The maid said to follow her. Yuki looked at her master with enthusiasm. Yuki breathed a sigh of relief and said that Lu Lai was right, because Juka and her son were fine. At that same second, Lu Lai lowered his head with his eyes closed in a grin. He turned to his assistant, saying that they had to hurry. Yuki's eyes widened when she heard Lu Lai's order. The main character straightened his shoulders proudly and looked to the side insidiously. Lu Lai said that they need to check. Exhausted and tired after giving birth, Juka lay in her room under a blanket with her son. The little boy lay on his mother Juka's chest with his eyes closed. Juka's husband entered the room through a wooden door to check on his wife after giving birth. Joyful Juka pressed her son to her chest while sitting on the bed. Juka was happy and thanked God that everything went well, so she told her husband that he could meet his son. Juka's husband looked at his son with inspiration and trepidation in his soul. Juka addressed her son, introducing him to his dad. Juka's husband said their son had her eyes. Juka said that when their son grows up, he will be as strong as his dad. The black silhouettes of Lu Lai and Yuki stood through the wooden bars behind the wall and watched what was happening. Lu Lai looked expressively through the wooden lattice into his magical yellow temporary eye. Information appeared above the little boy in the form of a biological clock. The name was unknown. Age, 5 minutes, 87 years, 4 months, 16 days, 4 hours, 8 minutes and 12 seconds left to live. Lu Lai saw all the information about the boy, but understood that they haven't given him a name yet. Juka and her husband raised their heads when two maids entered their room. The courtiers said with joy in their eyes that according to established practice, the father must choose the name of the newborn. Pleased with his fatherhood, Juka's husband held his son in his arms and looked at him with love. He thought about what to name his son. Lu Lai stood aside and watched, guessing that the name should have been Ian. 3 cards appeared with the biological characteristics of life. Name Louis, age 6 minutes, 87 years, 4 months, 1 day, 4 hours, 7 minutes, 45 seconds left to live. The name is Garrett, age 6 minutes, left to live 66 years, 1 month, 12 days, 8 hours, 7 minutes, 15 seconds. Name Michael, age 6 minutes, 99 years, 1 month, 25 days, 18 hours, 1 minute, 13 seconds left to live. Yuki looked questioningly towards her boss. Yuki asked that the name the baby's father gave had nothing to do with who they were looking for, so she assumed they might have made a mistake. The protagonist smiled slightly, looking at the floor. He understood that the child's name was still uncertain. Lu Lai took out his gold watch and Yuki looked at it in surprise. Lu Lai said that Yuki took the lead here. The black silhouettes of the maids and Dina and her husband were frozen in time in a dark space. Yuki glowed with a bright light and with fear in her eyes looked into the room where the guys were. The timid stamping of Yuki's feet was heard in the room. Yuki frantically entered the room where everything was frozen in time along with the black silhouettes of the maids. Yuki shyly and embarrassedly walked through the black frozen silhouettes of people in the room. Yuki came close to Juka. Yuki opened her mouth and whispered in Juka's ear. Juka widened her eyes and furrowed her eyebrows. Juka's husband, holding the child in his arms, looked questioningly at his wife along with two maids. Juka said the name Tesla. Juka's husband laughed ironically, not understanding what his wife said. Juka looked down in fear and horror and said that someone next to her said the child's name Nikola Tesla. Juka's husband put his hand on her shoulder and tried to calm him down, while Juka was in shock and sweat. Tesla's father turned to his wife and thought that she was overtired and noticed that Michael was the most suitable name for the child. Juka said that it was definitely not a hallucination. Juka, along with her husband, who was holding the child, standing next to her, looked questioningly towards the maid. The black-cloaked maid clasped her hands and pressed them to her chest, exclaiming joyfully. She noted with enthusiasm that this was a divine revelation, because their child was chosen by God himself and a great future certainly awaited him. With a malicious expression on his face, Lulai eavesdropped on the conversation. Tesla's father looked down at the maid, raising his eyebrows. He noticed that it sounded unusual. The little boy was wrapped in a blue sheet and fast asleep. It was eventually called Tesla. The old epoch-making city took on cloudy weather. The horse pulled a cart and a driver behind it, moving through the narrow streets of the city. Yuki and Lulai rode in this carriage. Yuki asked Lulai that she didn't quite understand why they didn't just rewind time to when Tesla grew up. Yuki timidly looked towards Lulai from under her long bangs. She asked her boss if she was wasting her time. The main character, with a satisfied expression on his face, rested his hand on his protruding chin and looked around the city streets through the window. Lulai imagined the image of Tesla, realizing that he was the closest person to God, so he asked Yuki if she was interested in seeing with her own eyes the key moments from his life. A cab driver lighting a pipe of tobacco. I looked out the window to the guys. He asked if they had arrived at their destination. Lulai rested his hand on the window frame and nodded to the cab driver with a malicious smile that they had arrived. A cabman in a black hat looked around the streets of the city, looking at the large white house in the alley. He said that with all due respect to Mr. Lulai, he said that a rich man like him should not have bought a house in this place. The main character looked forward with pleasant anticipation, resting his chin on his hand. He understood that this place more than suited him. Juka in a white apron stood next to her husband, who was sorting through things while sitting on the ground. She turned to him, asking when they would move. The Tesla father in a white t-shirt said that he understood everything, but added that the recent work environment did not bode well and he hoped that he would not be fired at all. Juka, along with her child and husband, turned their attention to the newly arrived guests. They watched as Lulai and Yuki stood outside their new home and settled in. Juka realized that these were their new neighbors and thought that they too were going through hard times. The main character looked slyly towards his neighbors, who he needed for his purpose. Lulai walked closer to Tesla's father and extended his hand to him in greeting. Lulai bowed his head respectfully and greeted his new neighbor, inventing a legend that he had come to this place on business from China. Juka and her husband shyly closed their eyes and smiled. They noticed that these were completely different people, adding that this was the first time they had seen the mysterious people from the east. Little Tesla lay in his blue diaper and made his baby noises. The main character stood next to Juka with his arms crossed and looked enthusiastically at the little Tesla in his mother's arms. Juka noted with a smile that their baby liked his new neighbors in the form of Lulai and Yuki. The protagonist lowered his head and looked gloatingly towards Juka and her husband. He said that they were given a great honor and he noted that they would definitely become good neighbors. Residents of the city were walking along the narrow alleys of the city. Lulai and Yuki lived in this small town for more than 10 years, and for this they became Tesla's neighbors to watch this prodigy grow up. Lulai sat on the wooden railing and rested his head on his crossed arms with a sad expression on his face. Lulai understood that even as a genius, Tesla had no way to escape ordinary life. Little Tesla sat and read his books while other children played their games, running through the city streets and frolicking. Lulai understood that being constantly absorbed in something is the same as being lonely. The main character ironically watched the smoothly growing Tesla. He knew that being a genius was not easy at all. Tesla's fearsome father crossed his arms under the cover of a full moon night as he stood outside his home. Tesla's father watched as his son returned home late at night and was about to enter the house. The terrible father angrily and arrogantly bowed down before his son, who was hiding books behind his back. Tesla's father told him not to hide junk behind his back. He also added that Tesla should have apologized for that I was late for dinner and my mother's soup was already cold. Bright yellow light leaked from the windows of the Tesla house late at night. Tesla and his father were sitting on a wooden dock near the river. He asked his son Tesla why he was wasting precious time studying such useless things. Tesla closed his eyes with a frown, clearly angered by the statement as his father sat next to him and discussed his future. The father reasoned that their family had not had the best of times and Tesla should follow in the footsteps of its father. Tesla humbly looked down and cast his questioning glance towards his father. He noticed that going to the village and working as a teacher when his father followed in the footsteps of his grandfather. Tesla asked his father if this was what he really wanted. The father got angry from such impudence and looked at his son offended. He said Tesla, so that he should be careful in his statements. After all, he just wanted his family not to starve. Tesla immediately frowned and began to express his point of view on this matter when his father widened his eyes and listened attentively. Tesla said he really enjoyed studying electrical engineering because it was the future of science and technology, so he wanted to create inventions that would change the world. Tesla's father moved his mustache and asked about his son's words that he should change the world. Tesla's father began to rise from the dock and Tesla looked questioningly at his father. My father noticed that only great people thought this way. Tesla was just the son of an ordinary teacher. The father walked away from the wooden dock as Tesla continued to look at his father questioningly. His father walked off the wooden bridge towards the illuminated street. My father told Tesla to throw this thought out of his head because he wouldn't repeat it twice. Tesla had nothing to say because he was afraid of contradicting his father. Tesla sighed sadly and looked gloomily towards his departing father. Tesla understood that this was the case every time he wanted to prove himself. Tesla was looking at his books and valuables when a black silhouette of a man began to approach him. Tesla didn't understand how they could throw away their dream. Yuki asked Tesla about what seemed to be some difficulties. Yuki stood over Tesla with her arms crossed. She asked Tesla that this time he also could not come to an agreement with his father. Tesla looked forward with heartache and said that his father could not understand him yet. Tesla grabbed his bag of stuff. He noted that he could pick up these parts again, even though it took a whole year. Yuki sat down on the dock next to Tesla and rested her hands, looking into the bottomless empty space. She said she had an idea. Yuki winked at Tesla and said that they had an empty attic at home, so it could work as a secret Tesla warehouse. The moon was shining brightly above the city in the pitch darkness. A joyful and inspired Tesla exclaimed. He was very happy that they could allocate a whole warehouse for him and he could use it, having asked in advance whether Lulai would be against such an idea. Yuki continued to look at Tesla with enthusiasm and joy. She ironically noted that it was precisely Mr. Lulai's idea and added that he had a very high opinion of him. The dim light of the lantern barely reached the wooden slatted pier. Tesla replied that Mr. Lulai was so kind and asked Yuki that he wanted to know something. Yuki said he can ask anything. The silhouette of a boy in a black cape appeared on the barely lit road. Tesla asked Yuki if she had enough magic. Yuki pretended that I didn't understand. Tesla noted that there were rumors that they didn't age at all. Yuki ironically noted that Tesla could do the same. He just needed to do 100 squats and 200 push-ups every day, and also needed to eat more bananas because they were very healthy. Tesla was sitting next to Yuki on the pier and turned towards the boy who began to enter the pier. Tesla noted that this theory did not sound very convincing. Yuki smirked ironically that the witchcraft theory didn't sound any more plausible. Tesla tensed slightly and raised his eyebrows, looking to the side. The guy in the black cape grabbed the Tesla pouch and started running away. Tesla realized that he had been robbed and he looked furiously towards the fleeing thief, who looked out from under his hood. The city was shrouded in the blankets of pitch darkness. Tesla was screaming for someone to catch this thief. Under the glowing full moon, the thief dumped the Tesla items out of the bag. The red-haired thief held a large gear in his hands and looked at it in amazement, slightly despairing. He didn't understand. What should he do with these treasures, because it was a heap of rubbish, and he realized that he was out of luck. The thief sadly rested his head on his crossed arms. He realized that this time his foray was not successful. The thief sat on the cold ground with his eyes closed, despairing that he would be able to eat properly that day. The thief sadly looked into the void, realizing that if he did not find food, he would die. The little boy with red hair raised his head hopefully and looked at the glowing moon. He turned to God and begged him to open his eyes and help him. Two black silhouettes towered over the unsuspecting thief. The main character and his assistant looked at the thief with contempt. Yuki crossed her arms and said that this boy was the thief. The exhausted and tired thief lay on the cold ground and sighed heavily. A worried Yuki came down to him and disturbed him. She tried to bring the boy to his senses. Yuki looked at the thief in shock. At that same second, she looked in numbness at her boss, who looked unshakable. Yuki screamed in alarm that the boy had a fever. The protagonist looked through his magical temporal eye at the exhausted boy lying on the cold ground. His biological clock said that this boy was 10 years old and had only 8 minutes and 4 seconds to live. Yuki held the little boy in her arms with a feeling of pity and heartache as Mr. Lulai stood unwaveringly behind them. He noticed that this guy was a little tramp and he was very weak, which meant that he would not last long. Yuki, in panic and anxiety, turned to her boss, who did not show that this situation bothered him in any way. Yuki screamed that the guy had a high fever and needed to be shown to the doctor urgently. She tried to call out to Lu Lai, who remained silent. Yuki looked anxiously at Lu Lai, who looked at what was happening indifferently. The main character noticed that all this was useless and this guy only had a few minutes to live. In sweat and hysterics, Yuki opened her eyes and turned to her boss. She asked him if he could prolong his life, because 8 minutes should have been enough to save his life. Lu Lai turned back towards Yuki and the thief despicably and mercilessly. He replied with disdain that he was not interested in this tramp because he was more interested in the bag of parts. Throwing his indifferent glance to the side, Lu Lai said that Tesla's time is his time. Lu Lai furrowed his eyebrows and looked back indifferently. He said that moreover, they travel through time and for every second spent in this era of the past, they pay an inflated price. Yuki looked at her boss with resentment and pity, holding the dying body of the thief in her hands. Lu Lai suggested what they would have to do if an unexpected situation occurred and there was not enough time, because before making important decisions, everything must be carefully thought through. The protagonist looked arrogantly at Yuki, who was sitting in tears over the lifeless body of the child. Lu Lai said that he had already decided everything about this situation and it was not discussed. Yuki addressed her master, calling him an arrogant dictator. Lu Lai was outraged by such an impudent statement from his assistant and frowned and put his hands on his belt. He rudely asked that he had heard correctly and asked his assistant to repeat his words. Lu Lai stood arrogantly in front of Yuki with his arms crossed, watching as she frantically fought for the thief's life. Yuki didn't understand when her master managed to become such a heartless bastard. Lu Lai ironically said that Yuki was fired. In anger and rage, Yuki furrowed her eyebrows and shouted towards Lu Lai. She said that he managed to gather so many outstanding personalities around him, but noted that there would be no point in this otherwise because his plans included the creation of a new world. Lu Lai pointedly covered his ears and looked angrily towards Yuki. He told her that Yuki was no longer a member of the Eternal Club, so he told her to contact him through the appointment booking. In a rage, Yuki screamed that when the time comes and there are no ordinary people, he will be left alone, so his actions will no longer make sense. Lu Lai rethought something and looked disdainfully towards Yuki with silence. Yuki looked at Lu Lai hurt and angry as the main character glared at her. She told Lu Lai to maintain her humanity and not succumb to the laws of time. Yuki meekly closed her eyes and said the words that they also wanted to feel that Lu Lai was also a person. The protagonist widened his eyes at what he heard. Two images of Lu Lai stood with their backs to each other, like two personifications of his feelings and inner world. He thought about how he might have succumbed to time. The dark night starry sky absorbed the bright moonlight along with the city. In a large room, on a huge bed, lay the lifeless body of a thief. Lu Lai waved his legs in different directions and threw his hands behind his head with anticipation. The main character closed his eyes and humbly waited for further events. The main character looked to the side disdainfully, peeking out gloomily from under his long bangs. The little boy lay unconscious on a large bed and covered with a warm blanket. His biological clock appeared. The name is Arthur, age 10 years. 10 years, 4 months, 7 minutes and 4 seconds left to live. Yuki crossed her arms bashfully and shyly and walked closer to her boss, who was looking at her with arrogance. Yuki began to apologize for her behavior. Without showing any positive emotions, Lu Lai slightly opened one eye and looked towards Yuki. He ironically asked her about how she had come to her senses after a recent performance. The time trader was sitting on his red upholstered sofa when Yuki bowed to Lu Lai in apology. She said with remorse that they had made a mistake and asked for forgiveness. In response, Lu Lai grinned and said that he would not discuss such trifles with her. Lu Lai approached Yuki with a proposal that was very unpleasant for her, which made Yuki angry and bewildered. Lu Lai noticed that the niece's younger cousin of the woman who cleans the Eternal Club was getting married, so he told her that Yuki would be in charge of cleaning Pang and Robert's rooms next month. With a dissatisfied face, Yuki replied that these two guys were dirty. Arthur began to come to his senses and gradually open his eyes. Yuki and Lu Lai turned their attention to Arthur's heavy sighs. Yuki immediately jumped up to the boy with a joyful expression on her face. She asked Arthur about his health and well-being. Arthur was surprised where he ended up and widened his eyes in horror. Realizing that he was trapped, he immediately jumped out of bed and rushed to run without looking back to the door. Lu Lai watched the escape taking place with a grin. He sarcastically joked to Arthur that he wanted to run away without gratitude. Arthur's body flew into the air and he began to wave his arms in panic as Lu Lai used his magic and made the boy's legs freeze. Arthur didn't understand what was going on and tried to scream for help. The time trader, along with Yuki, who was in confusion, watched what was happening. Lu Lai said that Yuki sacrificed her half a year's salary and bonus for Arthur, so he added that he couldn't just run away because it wouldn't be very polite. Yuki was at a loss because she was deprived of her salary and bonus. Arthur hung upside down and looked at the guys in horror. He asked Lulai if he was a sorcerer. Arthur understood that the rumors about Lulai were true. It was deep night outside and bright moonlight made its way through the windows of the houses. The thief fell to the floor and began to bow at his feet. He turned to Lulai, telling him to accept his bow. Lulai put his hands in his pockets and watched the boy who was sitting on the floor. Lulai ordered Arthur to stand up and tell him what happened. The thief immediately began to give out all the information and said that his name was Arthur and his adoptive mother brought him to this place. The time trader looked at the boy arrogantly with his arms crossed. Lulai asked the boy if his mother knew that he was stealing. With heartache and sadness on his face, Arthur looked at the floor. He said he was asked by a man to steal something in the suburbs. Yuki was confused and looked at Arthur, who bared his teeth and became angry. Yuki asked about the man, thinking that he was Arthur's adoptive father because that would be too much. After all, you couldn't ask your children for this. Arthur said that it was not his father, but a leftist guy. Arthur hit the floor with his fist in anger. He thought the man was trash